In Europe in the 17th century, the treatment of non-human animals began to change. Previously, there had been a widespread utilitarian view of animals as servants of humankind. Some people, such as the philosopher René Descartes, even viewed non-human animals as automata, functioning like clocks. The discovery that they could feel pain and emotion led to a shift in the ethics of how they should be treated. Today, we see frequent attempts to effect an ethical shift backwards by certain parties who want to convince society that people who don't believe in God cannot possess moral values. Now, I know theists who love and accept me and acknowledge my morality as legitimate and respectable, even though they know I'm an atheist. But certain other theists say that I have no morality because it's impossible to define morality without the concept of a God. Whilst people with an agenda to undermine atheists of course have an interest in creating their own self-serving definitions of morality, we're fortunate that the actual definition has a long-established usage. And since accuracy is always best in fair and honest discussion, let me give that impossible definition from my Oxford Dictionary. Morality is a system of principles concerned with the goodness or badness of human character or behaviour, or with the broader distinction between right and wrong. Atheists and theists alike can make valid moral judgments, whether some choose to acknowledge that or not. But let's look at the assertion that morality without God's absolute standard is self-contradictory, a matter of arbitrary preference. Firstly, while one may certainly have a preference for either welcoming or blocking out ideas that challenge one's moral values, one doesn't prefer to find things moral or immoral. Moral values are the product of the extent to which we feel empathy, of our experiences of living alongside our fellow humans and other living creatures, of our ability to reason, and of our knowledge about the world. But the main argument here for dismissing atheist morality is that they don't have the divine absolute standard. An absolute standard of morality refers to a set of values that will never change. We're told by theists who use the idea of divine absolute morality to dismiss atheists that the nature of their God provides the standard of morality. And since his God's nature is perfect and therefore unchanging, so are its moral values. This reasoning suffers from several assumptions, the greatest being, of course, that a God exists. But assuming that a God does exist, the claim that this God's nature is known to be perfect, or that any ideas about its character are based on more than faith, is simply untenable. Even as someone who doesn't believe in gods, I freely admit that I don't know there are no gods. Despite the current lack of evidence for any God, which leads me on a simple pragmatic level to live my life on the basis that none exists, I allow for the possibility that I could be wrong. Those who claim to know that a God exists and that its nature is perfect allow for no such possibility. But even if we grant the assumptions that a God exists and its nature is perfect, the argument for divine absolute moral values has certain consequences that many who use it seem not to have considered. One is that believing in a God and doing what you think it wants is far from good enough. If specific divine values exist, guessing what they are is pointless. Guesses could be as numerous as the stars in the universe. But those who can't be sure of what their God's absolute values are can be no more morally superior to the atheists they label amoral and relativistic. Invoking divine values forces the theist into the position of either knowing as a matter of certainty what those specific values are, or having no right to use the argument as a way of asserting their own moral superiority and the amorality of atheists. And simply claiming to know as a matter of certainty what these specific divine values are isn't good enough either. People claim to know all sorts of things. If I turned up in a court of law and claimed to know someone was guilty of murder without there being solid evidence to back up my claim, only a corrupt court would sentence that person on my word. In that scenario, the fate of only one person is at stake. Divine moral absolutism would have repercussions for the treatment of a large portion of the world's population. So considering the fact that some are using this claimed knowledge of divine standards to try literally to demoralise all atheists, we justified in demanding that they provide solid evidence of how they gained access to these exclusive truths. The Bible is certainly not a source of absolute values. If there is a perfect God, it's very different from the God of the Bible, a God that kills almost all life on earth and then forbids murder. These are highly conflicting values, incompatible with a perfect absolute standard. Now, if one is arguing God's might makes his own murders right, then at least we know we're talking about power rather than intrinsic moral perfection. Those in positions of power sometimes do give themselves free rein to murder, to compel others to obey, or to torture them for resisting. But let's not suggest that has anything to do with what's right. Power doesn't imply moral perfection, or any particular morality for that matter. Nor are all biblical values unchanging. On the contrary, sermons I heard in church as a child were highly critical of the Old Testament's brutal morality, promoting instead the New Testament's compassion. Whereas the Old Testament has its God instructing, show no pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, Jesus says in the New Testament that we should instead turn the other cheek. Let's remember, divine absolute morality doesn't just require high standards, it requires perfect, unchanging standards. So a single case of a shift in values destroys the whole concept, and this is a clear case of such a shift. Some try to dismiss this by arguing that the God of the Bible hasn't changed, only the nature of our relationship with it has changed. That's a fine attempt to distract us from the clarity of these opposing statements, but when the smoke and mirrors are gone, we're always left with a God that actively directs people towards vengeance, then actively discourages it through Jesus. What does the divine absolutist do? Turn the other cheek while slapping you round the face? It's simply not credible to claim that one can uphold all biblical values. There's too much contradiction. People use the Bible to support values that are diametrically opposed. Some believe divorce is always wrong. A friend of mine was excluded from their church after divorcing an abusive partner. Some believe it's sometimes acceptable, others that it's no one's business but the couple concerned. Some feel remarriage is always wrong. Some believe it's acceptable in certain cases, though they disagree on which cases qualify. Others have no problem with remarriage at all. Some people believe that polygamy is discouraged by their God. Others believe their God condones it. Some people feel that gay relationships are wrong. Others feel that it's the oppression and condemnation of gay people that's wrong. Some theists feel it's morally acceptable to withhold a blood transfusion from a dying child. Other theists find that attitude a moral disgrace. Which permutation of these differing values agrees with the divine standard? They can't all agree. All these values are claimed by some to be supported by the Bible. So on what other basis can anyone claim that they, rather than their fellow theists, are promoting the divine standard? Personal conviction is no barometer of who knows best. Consider the many religious groups who believe everyone outside their group is going to hell. People from Group A say everyone else is going to hell. People from Group B say the same. Before we look at a third group, every single person on the planet is already considered by someone to be deserving of unending fiery torture. If you're one of those people who tell others with great reluctance, or not so great reluctance, that they're going to hell, bear in mind that there are those out there who'd say exactly the same about you with equal conviction. So on what objective evidence can you make that boldest of claims that you alone know the divine truth about hell and who's going there? To me, the whole concept of hell is immoral, and those who aren't sickened by the idea of people being doomed to eternal agony simply for not believing in God, or the right God, reveal far more about their moral failings than I ever could. If striving to be a good person isn't good enough for the gleeful "you're going to hell" brigade in their God, that speaks volumes to me about the worthiness of those values, and I would never want any part of them. I can't think of a single person that I'd want to see suffer in eternal agony. But then again, I don't believe in hell, because there's not one scrap of credible evidence for it. Let's face the truth. Statements like these are designed to stigmatise and ultimately strip away the perceived humanity of atheists, an extraordinarily diverse group of people who simply have a healthy scepticism about a set of claims for which they see no evidence. Those who think they've slipped their God into the basic definition of morality without anyone noticing fool only themselves. Atheists see this dishonest attempt to redefine language for what it is. Despite the concerted efforts of those unreasonable theists who find it so difficult to tolerate others' differing beliefs, the formation of moral judgments by people across the whole spectrum of belief continues. I believe that when it's recognised that the stigmatisation and abuse of decent citizens is the pressing moral issue, rather than people's thoughts on the existence of gods, there'll be a much greater chance of harmony in the world. The argument that divine absolute standards provide the only legitimate morality fails on many levels. It seems ironic to me that the people who use it are often the same people who object to the unflattering notion that theists need a god to tell them murder and rape are wrong. The idea that theists can't work this out for themselves is a disparaging stereotype that many object to, I think with good reason. But in fact, anyone who claims there's no legitimate morality without their God is literally saying you can't know murder and rape are wrong without God telling you first. In denying the morality of non-theists, they end up supporting the very stereotype they find so insulting. But for me, the most significant irony in all this is that trying to convince society that people who don't believe in gods have no moral validity is in itself a deeply immoral act. After all, if you only acknowledge the humanity of your brothers and sisters, is that really something to be admired?